there, my name is Sydney, and today we will be talking about canning. We'll talk about the different types of canning used to preserve foods, and then give you 2 easy recipes to start your canning journey. Canning allows you to take food and preserve it for long periods of time. This is because foods often have a large water content, which makes it perishable. Foods become perishable by interacting with different enzymes and bacteria, which then grows mold. Proper canning removes oxygen, destroys mold-causing enzymes and bacteria, and then creates a seal so that the food stays fresh for as long as possible. The seal keeps liquid, air, and any other bacteria from entering those cans, so you can keep cans or jars shelved for long periods of time without it spoiling. There are 2 methods to canning: water bath canning and pressure cooker canning. Pressure canning can be done with any food. You pressure can by using a traditional pressure cooker. Pressure canning can be done with any food, from fruits to vegetables and even meat. You can only can meat and most vegetables via pressure cooker canning because these foods are lower in acid. The acid in food is what helps keep food from spoiling by slowing the process enough to give you time to eat it first. Unfortunately, pressure canning can't be done in multi-use cookers like an Instapot. The USDA doesn't recommend pressure canning with one of these multi-use cookers because they don't think that the food gets hot enough to actually kill all of the bacteria and to properly remove all of the oxygen. If you have a traditional pressure cooker, then the world is your oyster and you can can pretty much anything. You can find information on pressure cooker canning at the National Center for Home Food Preservation. Water bath canning is great for foods that are high in acid, such as fruits, jams, and pickles. Food that contains a fair bit of acid, which has disinfecting qualities, helps kill all of the enzymes without the heated pressure of a pressure cooker. Water bath canning is used to sanitize the jars before filling and heating them to create a seal within the jar. Water bath canning is the most beginner-friendly method of canning, so that's the method we'll be using today. Between fruits, jams, pickles, and other fermented foods, you still have pretty much unlimited options of what you can using the water bath canning method. To get started, you will need the largest pot that you have. This should hold at least 4 canning jars or more. You will also need canning jars, the lids and rings for those jars, a jar lifter, a canning funnel, towels or pot holders, pots and bowls for making your mix that will go into the jars, spoons or knives to help get all of the air out in your cans, and the food that you are going to be canning. To start your water bath canning, you'll fill that large pot up with water and then put water-filled jars into that pot. You want the jars to be in the boiling water for at least 5 minutes to sanitize the jars. You will also want to place the lids and the rings in a pot of water to simmer to also sanitize those. Take the jars out of the pot of boiling water now that they're sanitized. You can then fill them with whatever foods you will be canning. Depending on what foods you're canning, make sure that there are no air bubbles within the jar. Then place the lid and ring on top of the jar. You can then use the jar lifter to put the jars into the boiling water, making sure that you are not tilting the jars at all so that no food gets into the rings. Depending on the recipe, you will boil those jars or cans from anywhere from 10 minutes to an hour. Usually, you will first put the cans in the water so that the water is below the lids. You will then add water to the pot to cover the lids to allow everything in the jar to heat up and kill all of the bacteria. Once your jars have finished sealing in the water bath, you can take them out using that jar lifter and place them on a toweled surface to cool. The jars should stay at least an inch apart to allow for airflow between the jars. and you will let them cool for at least 24 hours. You want to wait for all of the contents to cool down completely before storing them away. You can check the seal after the 24 hours to make sure it's properly been preserved. If the top pops at all, that means that there is still air inside the jar and it hasn't been properly canned. You can place these cans in the refrigerator and consume them in the next couple of weeks. All right, the first recipe that we'll be creating are dill pickles. To create these dill pickles, you will need 4 quart-sized jars, 8 garlic cloves, 10 pickling cucumber, a 1/4 cup of white vinegar, and a 1/4 cup of pickling salt. Pickling salt is best because if you use iodized salt, the brine will become murky and unclear. This recipe is also super customizable to your taste. You can add things such as bell peppers, pearl onions, or mustard seeds to change the flavor. First, wash your jars in soapy water. Rinse and place them in your water bath canner to sanitize and prepare the jars for canning. In a large saucepan, bring water, vinegar, and salt to a boil. Turn off the heat and set aside. Take the cans out of the water bath, pouring out the water on the inside, and place the jars on a toweled surface. Place a layer of dill at the bottom of each jar, as well as 1 clove of garlic. Now place the pickling cucumbers into your jars, packing them as tightly as possible. If you can't fit a lot of cucumbers into the jars, you can cut them in half or in quarters in order to fit more into the jar. Once you have all of your cucumbers tightly packed into the jars, you can add another layer of dill and another garlic clove if you choose. Now pour the brining liquid into the canning jars, leaving 1/2 inch of air at the top. Add the lid and ring to each jar and screw on tightly. Place the jars into the water bath, making sure that the water is just below the neck of the jars. Let it sit in the water bath for 5 minutes before adding enough water to cover the jars at least 1 inch. Once the water is 1 inch above the jars, cover the pot and let boil for 15 minutes. Once the 15 minutes has elapsed, turn off the heat and take off the cover. Let the jars sit for another 5 minutes before using your jar lifter to carefully take them out of the pot and onto a toweled surface or onto a cooling rack. Let the jars sit undisturbed for 12 to 24 hours. Make sure that the jars are at least 1 inch apart to allow for airflow, but also be sure that there is not any AC directly hitting the jars while they cool. Once the jars have completely cooled, test the seal by tapping the top of the jar. If your jars have been properly sealed, you can store them in a cool, dry place for up to a year. The second recipe we'll be making is apple butter. To make apple butter, you will need 2 pounds of apples, 2 cups of sugar, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, 1/2 teaspoon of nutmeg, and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. First, peel and core your apples and place them into a slow cooker. Set the slow cooker on high heat and cook for 3 hours. This gets the apples cooking faster. Stir the cooked apples and set on low. At this point, leave the lid ajar to allow moisture to escape. Allow this to cook, stirring occasionally, first with a spoon and then with a whisk, until it creates an applesauce consistency. Once it hits an applesauce consistency, you can add the sugar and the spices and mix again before cooking for 2 more hours. Whisk occasionally until it becomes a smooth and silky consistency. Once the apple butter is to the consistency that you want, you can then prepare the jars for canning. Funnel or ladle the apple butter into the jars and then use a knife or a spoon to get out all air bubbles. Place the lid and rings on top, screwing tightly before placing back into the water bath. Boil the cans for 10 to 15 minutes before taking them out and placing them on a toweled surface. Make sure the jars are at least 1 inch apart to allow for airflow. Check these jars after 24 hours, or once they have completely cooled to make sure that they are properly sealed. Once your cans are correctly sealed, you can store them in a cool, dry place until you're ready to eat them. When canning, we use the when in doubt, throw it out method. But here are some signs that the food in your jars are not good to eat anymore. If the jars are leaking or swollen, if the jars look damaged or cracked or abnormal in any way, if the tops of the jars pop before you have opened them for the first time, if the jar spurts liquid or foam when you do open it for the first time, or if the food becomes discolored, mushy, or slimy. These are all signs that air or bacteria has gotten into the jars and the food has spoiled. If you would like any more information on canning, visit the National Center for Home Food Preservation. If you would like to make either of the recipes mentioned in this video, the links will be down below in the description box. Thank you for joining me, and I hope you have fun on your canning journey.